Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 1, Halacha 1, Part 2 of the Shir, and the Art Scroll 2A1. It's going to be a very short Gemara. So, the Mishnah was talking about barley and oats. Again, we have these pairs, and the question is going to be, well, we know that a main species like barley is going to be where there's a variety like oats. Apparently oats in the Chokhmah of the Hachamim is going to be a variety of barley, and therefore it's not going to be subject with Kilayim to one another because they are related. They are a subset of each other. So where are you going to have Kilayim in there? Well, in this list in the Mishnah, like if you have wheat and you have the fava bean, that is going to be Kilayim with one another. And this rest of the shir is going to get into also the Yerukot for Pesach. What about, we have these 5 species that can be for dispatching the obligation for Pesach when you do the maror. Well, is that going to be Kilayim with one another? And that has implications on how you run your farm, because it means that you can or can't plant these things next to each other. So the Mishnah stated barley and oats, and the Mishnah is listing these 12 species. We have wheat, we have darnel, we have barley, we have oats, spelt, rye, and it's concluding that they are not Kilayim with each other within this pair. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, all of them are pairs. In other words, the 12 species of the Mishnah are grouped together in these 6 pairs. And that means that each plant is allowed only with the other member of that pair. But it doesn't go with the other of these 10 species. So, again, the wheat cannot go with the fava bean, but the wheat can go with the darnel. So, the Mishnah, says Amara Fulda, could conceivably be read as a single list of 12 plants that are not Kilayim with each other. And the Gemara is trying to teach otherwise. The Gemara is trying to hone in on this, says Amara Fulda, and the Mishnah is enumerating pairs of plants so that each plant is not Kilayim with its pair, but it is Kilayim with one of the other sets of pairs. And again, we're talking about pairs of 1, 2, not pairs like, from the tree that you get to eat. That's a joke. But anyway, for this reason, the Mishnah is talking about where it inserts these words that there are not Kilayim with each other. And immediately after this first pair, where it talks about wheat and darnel, it says they are not Kilayim with each other. And this is being used, says the Mara Fulda, to point out that these are to be read as pairs and not as a group of 12 plants that you can plant in a farm all next to one another. By the way, I want to point out that outside of Eretz Yisrael, that's going to be the case for Kalei Zerayim. But inside of Eretz Yisrael, you have this law outside of Eretz Yisrael that it doesn't apply except to Rabbanan. So if you're having a garden in Chicago or you're having a garden in New York, that is going to apply only to Rabbanan. And Doraita, it's going to apply here in Eretz Yisrael. And that is going to apply even today. So the laws of Kilayim did not go away with the exile. And the Gemara continues. And we see the Gemara asking a question. It says, was Rabbi Yochanan's point stated in reference to the entire chapter or only in reference to this halacha and this Mishnah? So this entire chapter is referring to the Mishnahs of this chapter that list certain vegetables as being permitted together. And these are the first 3 Mishnahs. So the Mishnah that we have in chapter 1, halacha 1, we're going to see it also in chapter 1, halacha 2, and chapter 1, halacha 3. It's going to lay out these plants that are going to be permitted together, and then it's going to get into lists of animals. And animals that are going to be allowed with one another. And again, there's a very practical reason why you're going to have some domestic animals that are going to be forbidden with the wild version of the animal. For instance, you have domestic goats and wild goats. You have domestic sheep and some breeds of wild sheep. And the wild versions are going to be considered to be Kilayim with the domestic versions in a lot of the cases, because first of all, the dikduk is going to demand that the wild version of that animal is a chaya, and the domestic version is going to be a behema. And the behema is what is offered on the temple, in the temple. So, you would have a legal problem if you were trying to bring, say, an ibex or something like that to the temple as a korban. And you could say, well, this is some sort of, wild sort of goat. And that's not the kind of goat that they're talking about, not in the dikduk and not in the tradition. So we see that it does matter for other applications. And also, there's other applications for getting your farms right. So in other words, what's going to be Kilayim with one another? Well, we know that barley is going to be there for the omer. And if your farm is not set up right and you have, say, your omer barley growing next to fava beans, well, that's going to be disqualified. You're not going to be able to bring that over for the omer. We're trying to set up these rational farms that are going to be able to be set up for use for the temple. So, for instance, if you have wheat that came from an area that's too close to a vineyard, well, that's going to disqualify your wheat from being used. Actually, it has to be burned. So there is a lot of, where it seems like, well, why are we talking about this, right? But in terms of actually trying to do the avoda, you can have where, certain things are going to be disqualified because your farms are not organized correctly. And you're going to violate Torah law, and you'd say, but it's barley, so what? And the idea is iterated by Rabbi Hilla in Masechet Challah, where they're talking about, can you dispatch an obligation with stolen matzah? Rabbi Hilla over there in Challah says that you cannot, because the Torah commandments are commandments only if you are doing them in the prescribed way. And if you're not doing them in the prescribed way, they're not commandments. So, in other words, did you dispatch the obligation of doing the matzah in the case of stolen matzah? No, because the prescribed way is to do it with, matzah that you own, that you somehow acquired or something like that in a legal way. And so you didn't actually dispatch the obligation of matzah by stealing somebody else's matzah or by stealing somebody else's lulav or sukkah or something like that. And over here, if you're not doing the vegetables right, and if you're not doing the agriculture in the correct way, you're going to be limited in doing the other things of the avoda as well. So there are a whole list of things that can be used that have to be done in the right way. For instance, when you're going to be making bread, and yes, you can make bread out of barley, you can make bread out of oats. Also, your barley is used in a mincha offering for the sota. So, if the farm was not organized correctly and is growing Kilayim, you're not supposed to be sitting there using those things for mitzvahs, right? Because it's not done in a prohibited way. You're only supposed to be doing mitzvahs in a way that's permitted, and you're not supposed to be doing mitzvahs in a prohibited way. So the Gemara is asking this question. It says, was Rabbi Yochanan's point stated in reference to this entire chapter or only in this halacha of this Mishnah? In other words, are we talking about these pairs only here, or are we also talking about these pairs and this way of reading this for the next set of Mishnahs that's going to be coming up? And would it be that, just this first Mishnah is talking about the pairs, and then the next sets of Mishnahs are going to be just making a list, and you read the whole list together? Or is it going to be where in the coming sets, that you're also supposed to read them as pairs and not as a total list. So the Gemara is going to answer that, and it's going to solve this question from a discussion based on that which Rav said. And the Gemara is talking about Rav, and here's what he says. He says, the 5 vegetables, this is going to be with doing the obligation of Pesach, and we know that lettuce and chicory are 2 of them. So it says the 5 vegetables which one can dispatch the obligation to eat maror on Pesach may all be planted in a single patch. And it has been said that this statement by Rav disagrees with a statement by Rabbi Yochanan. In other words, the question is, are these all going to be pairs, or are they all going to be read as a list? Now, 2 of the 5 vegetables are going to be good for maror. That's going to be lettuce and chicory. But Rav is allowing the 5 vegetables that are going to be okay for doing the mitzvah of having the maror on, the Pesach, and he's saying that you're allowed to plant it together. And he's basically saying that a mixture of lettuce and chicory are going to be allowed, and Rabbi Yochanan is going to disagree with Rav. And he's going to basically be saying that lettuce and chicory are forbidden together, and that's going to be because 2 of those vegetables are going to be listed in the next Mishnah, and it's going to read like this. The next Mishnah is going to say lettuce and mound lettuce, and it's going to put that together as a pair. So lettuce and mound lettuce are not going to be Kilayim with one another. And then the next pair in the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Yochanan's reading, is going to be chicory and field chicory, and that those are not going to be Kilayim with each other. Now, clearly, Rabbi Yochanan is interpreting this Mishnah as listing pairs, because otherwise all of the plants it mentions, including lettuce and chicory, would be allowed with one another. And the Gemara says that this indicates that when Rabbi Yochanan said all of them are pairs, he's referring not only to this first Mishnah, but also to the rest of the chapter. In other words, how do we read the rest of the chapter coming up? Now, Rav is referring to the next Mishnah, and he's going to be stating that lettuce and mound lettuce, chicory and field chicory are not Kilayim with one another, and basically he's reading it as together as a list. And the idea is that if the Mishnah is just listing pairs, then lettuce is permitted only with mound lettuce, and chicory is only permitted with field chicory. But in reading it this way that Rabbi Yochanan does, then lettuce and chicory would be Kilayim with each other. They would not be allowed to be planted next to each other. So you wouldn't be able to do that. And you certainly can't run a farm that way. And Rav is saying that you can. Now I want to go to the Rambam, and the Rambam in Hilchos Kilayim 1.8 is saying like this. It's explaining that both Yerushalmi and Zerayim are subsets of a larger category of plants known as garden seeds, and that includes all plants whose seeds are not eaten. And of these, some are normally planted in small plots and known as Yerushalmi, while others are planted in fields and known as Zerayim. So generally speaking, Zerayim is planted in fields, and Yerushalmi is planted in gardens and plots. And this is, talking about a day before you had like big industrial farming. I've seen big industrial farms where, it's really like a field of lettuce. It's massive. And, they're doing big volume and have the way to keep it fresh and to get it to market. But that's not really how, lettuce was done, say 2,000 years ago, or even up until the modern day with refrigeration. Really, you had a small garden, and you had a couple of garden seeds, and you planted a few things of lettuce, and that was that. And it was easy to keep it fresh because you only picked it when you need it. And, you didn't have supermarkets and all of these things. So the question is, how are we to read this in terms of pairs and in terms of, Yerushalmi versus Zerayim versus garden seeds? And, how are we supposed to start looking at this? So the Gemara attributed the statement where it says all of them are pairs, and that's going to be said by Rabbi Yochanan. And now the question is, what about Rav's position? So Rabbi Ba says in the name of Rav and says that all of them are pairs. And in other words, Rav is also saying that the next set might also be pairs as well, according to Rabbi Ba. And the Gemara is asking and saying, well, it looks like the opinion of Rav has been reversed, because certainly, if he's allowing these, 5 of these species to be planted together in a garden, in plots and things like that, where you're not having these separations, well, then it looks like you're just reading it together as a list and you're not making it like a pair. And again, one of the things to take away from this is that, you have to look at this in terms of organizing your fields. And that's why it matters, like, oh, you can put this with this, that's okay. Or you can read it as a list, and you can put all of them together, then your field is going to look a lot different. So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, that the opinion has been, of Rav has been reversed. And it says there, regarding the 5 vegetables that are going to be available for maror, he says that they are all single species, and therefore they can be planted in a single patch. In other words, what he's really saying is he's saying that lettuce and chicory, which are going to be 2 of these 5 vegetables, are not Kilayim with each other because they're really coming from the same species. And that's, when he's reading this in a list, that's how he's reading it. And the Gemara says, yet here he says this. In other words, he's saying that all of them are pairs, and that implies that a mixture of lettuce and chicory is not allowed, since these 2 vegetables are not grouped together as a pair. So, if the Mishnah is going to be listing it as pairs, then certainly lettuce is going to be allowed only with the mound lettuce, and the chicory is going to be only allowed with the field chicory. So how do we check to see if Rav's statements are contradicting each other, and how do we fit it together? And the Gemara is going to try to fit Rav's statements together with the 5 vegetables that are going to be fit for maror. Because again, Rav is still holding that you can plant these together. And that, if they weren't Kilayim, you wouldn't be, with one another, you wouldn't be able to plant them together. So the Gemara says that it is not that Rav said they are all single species, which may be planted initially next to each other. Rather, he said that they are all types of Yerushalmi, as opposed to Zerayim. And thus, all of them may be planted in a garden patch that measures 6 by 6 tefachim. So basically, we're getting back to this question about Yerushalmi seeds versus Zerayim seeds. And Yerushalmi seeds are going to be going into garden patches, and Zerayim seeds like wheat or barley are going to be going into these large open fields. And again, these garden patches of something that, you don't grow a very large volume of lettuce back in this day, because again, you don't have refrigeration, you have to use it right away, and you can't store it. And so, again, it's going to be a 6 by 6 tefachim thing. And again, you're going to have these patches. So, again, each patch is going to be 6 by 6, and you're going to plant each of these 5 species in a small patch. So, in fact, Rav holds, says the Marafulda, that lettuce and chicory are a distinct species, which is going to indeed be Kilayim with each other. So, in other words, he's saying that, there is an issue between lettuce and chicory. They're 2 different things. It's not a subspecies, not the same thing. And the Gemara is saying that when he said that, they may be planted in a single patch, he did not mean that they are planted directly next to each other. Rather, he's trying to say that they can be planted in a patch that measures 6 by 6 tefachim. And this leniency applies only to Yerushalmi. And this is going to be different than Zerayim. And Zerayim can't be planted in a small area next to each other. But Yerushalmi, which are going to be garden seeds, can. And Rav is trying to teach that the 5 plants fit for maror, that these are going to all be Yerushalmi, and it's all subject to this leniency. In other words, what the Rosh Cirilio says about this is that Rav never intended to classify all the 5 maror vegetables as a single species, and that, by the way, would mean that there's no restrictions whatever on planting them together. What he's trying to point out, says the Rosh Cirilio on the reading of this Gemara, his point is that they are all considered Yerushalmi, And you have to divide this in your mind between Yerushalmi having laws on one side and Zerayim have a different set of laws on the other side. And all of the 5 species that dispatch the obligation for maror, these are all going to be Yerushalmi, and there's a leniency on planting them together. However, Rav's point is that you still have this case of pairs. You are not reading this as a single list. You're still making it where it's read as you're reading it as pairs where things outside of the pair can be Kilayim with one another. So really what he's saying is that you can plant it in a garden patch, and the minimum measure on that is going to be a 6 by 6 tefachim spot. And the Pnei Moshe is going to read it like this. He's going to be saying about this like this, that Rav's point is to be that the 5 vegetables fit for maror, and they're classified as Yerushalmi. And this, by the way, is going to fit the explanation in Bavli Psachim 39b. And the Bavli, by the way, rejects it on grounds that the Mishnah explicitly refers to maror plants as Yerushalmi, and that basically would make any teaching redundant. So the Bavli is going to be concluding that Rav's teaching is needed only with regard to lettuce, because one might have thought that since lettuce becomes hard and it spreads out its roots over a wide area and in a different way than these other vegetables, that perhaps it may not be planted with other species in a garden patch, even though it's going to be a yeruk, like a vegetable. And the idea in the Bavli, says the Pnei Moshe, is that Rav is teaching otherwise, and that as long as the lettuce is not yet hardened, it can be planted in a garden patch. And that's going to be the idea between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi over here. And really, there's no contradiction. We're just trying to understand different ways of how these nuances fit together. Now, the Mishnah continued, and it says the pole. The modern way that it's said in Hebrew or Arabic is fool, and that is going to be the fava bean. And then it says together with the sapir. And the last 6 plants listed in this Mishnah, by the way, are the pole or fool, the sapir, the puden, the tofach, the fool halavan, and the shius. Now the Gemara is going to identify them. And again, we have these in pairs so that, if you have the fava bean, which is fool or pole, that you can't plant this next to wheat or barley, and that this can go next to a variety that's similar to it, like the sapir, which is going to be this Egyptian cow bean. And we saw a lot about the special cases about these Egyptian cowpeas in Shvius. In Masechet Shvius, this comes up a lot because the halacha is going to be a little bit different from other Yerushalmi. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Chia Barva that it was found written upon the writing tablet of Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Alas. And here's what it said. It said, before quoting the content of the writing, the Gemara is going to cite a dissenting report of where it was found. So Rabbi Yonah says in the name of Rabbi Chia Barva that it was found written upon the walls of Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Alas. So one version says it was on a writing stylus, and the other says it was written on the wall. Anyway, here's what was quoted, and the Gemara says that the Mishnah's last 6 plants are Pila, Pil Shonua, Gilbona Milvasa, Sar Pavna, and Pil Sitah. Now, this is going to be the pole mentioned in the Mishnah as known as Pilah. In other words, apparently over the years, the meaning of the Hebrew names listed in the Mishnah were forgotten, and Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Alas, is trying to translate them into the common use of Hebrew back in the day. Now, the authors of the Yerushalmi had a written version of the Mishnah that concluded where it said the white bean and the shiun with the nun at the end of the shiun. And the Gemara is going to correct this version, and it's going to say this is how the Gemara actually reads. It says the white bean and the shius. In other words, with a sof at the end. And this contrast between the shius or the shiun with the nun at the end and the shius with the sof. And this is going to be a type of bean. And accordingly, the Mishnah's word on the bean or fool or pool is going to refer both of its following words. Say the white levan, that's going to be the shius. And it's speaking of these two kinds of beans, the white bean and the shius bean. And the Gemara is going to say that, why is the shius bean given this name? And Rabbi Yonah says, why is it called shius? Because it gladdens the heart and it purges the innards. In other words, that it's saying like the word shiut is related to the word shoah, which is gladness, and from like sha'oah, which is smooth out. So in other words, these beans are going to gladden the heart because it has this like sedative effect. And you can see this, by the way, referred to in Bereshit Rabbah 94:2, where this bean is talked about over there. And over there it's talking about how it smooths out and it purges the innards by acting as a laxative. So I want to point out that some of the names are going to be, in question as to, which exact variety are any of these things, whether it's going to be the plant or even when we start to get into these species of animals. And so a lot of times when people are going to be like a critic of the Gemara and they're going to talk about the bats, and there's a famous Gemara in Bechorot that refers to bats and eggs. We know that bats don't lay eggs. And so it uses a word of a bird, and it's really kind of unclear exactly which bird this is. This is clearly not talking about the mammal, because that bat, a bat we know doesn't lay eggs. It's clearly talking about something else. And a lot of these names that are written in the Torah, or names in these Yerakot, or these names in these vegetables or animals, a lot of times it's very unclear as to like exactly what's going to be the vernacular. And that's really the point of what Rabbi Yossi is saying about what was found on the walls or the writing stylus of Rabbi Hillel, son of Rabbi Elas, is they're trying to preserve this in terms of writing in the vernacular. And you see this a lot today with the modern temini. And so there's a lot of different varieties of locusts and crickets, and we know the names of them, right? But can we identify exactly which one it is, like over in Taman? And I've seen many times there's a Taimini shul here in Har Nof, and they have a ceremony that they do every couple of years in Bnei Brak, where the Taimini get together and they want to keep the tradition of eating the locusts alive. And they try to find the locust here in Eretz Yisrael and identify it. And I've seen many locusts here in Eretz Yisrael. And there's a well-known rabbi who wrote a book named Yoel Schwartz, wrote a book on the locusts. And we had a bunch of locusts at the yeshiva here in Har Nof. And we were watching him try to identify, which are going to be, which name of locust that's going to be kosher variety or not kosher variety. Of course, unless you're Temeni and you have the tradition, you're a Temeni rabbi, you can't eat the locust, even if you can identify it. But from my perspective, they all looked like locusts. They all looked the same. But there were differences when I learned more about it. You could see in the way the legs were. You can see in the way the height of the legs were. And when on closer observation, you could start to see that there were some varieties in it. And even though they all look the same. And that's the point, like when there are words that designate which kind of locust is going to be treif and which one is going to be kosher. And a lot of that is based on tradition, and it's very easy to lose that. That's why the Temeni are trying to hold on to this tradition by getting together and doing this ceremony of eating the locusts in Bnei Brak every couple of years, so that the tradition doesn't get lost and also the knowledge doesn't get lost. But a lot of dealing with these beans, the Mishnah writes it as shiun, instead of shius, and it might have been in an earlier time that it was shiun instead of shius. And so, again, when you go to the grocery store and you're trying to find this white bean, are you talking about a cannellini bean? Like which exactly, kind of white bean are you talking about? There's a lot of different varieties of white bean. And so, a lot of that is going to be the case when you're dealing with Gemara critics that are trying to take a very modern academic university reading of the stuff to criticize. You also see this with Christian missionaries, unfortunately. And, a lot of it is sort of academic laziness where rather than, recognize that, some of this, might have been lost, they'll say, oh, God forbid, look how, silly Chazal is, God forbid. And they'll say that, oh, you see that, bats are laying eggs and look, Chazal, whatever. And, they'll say like, therefore, Christian missionary nonsense, right? And that's really the point, though. The point is that, when you're talking about this name of this kind of animal, like which exactly is it? And that, so you might apply a modern translation and say it's a bat. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bat. And it's like, when we were standing with Yoel Schwartz in the yeshiva, outside the yeshiva, watching all of these locusts, trying to identify them and see like which ones would be edible by the Temeni and which ones aren't. Again, they all kind of look the same. And the point is that unless you really have this tradition of this is this with this name, it fits this name, and this is what it looks like, it's very hard to tell. And that's why, it's very important to go back to look at the Meforshim on all of these names to try to figure it out. Because again, in the halacha that's going to be coming up, we're going to be talking about different kinds of melon. And like exactly which kind of melon are you talking about, right? Or it's going to be talking about, different kinds of, other Yerkot, like a wild leek. What's going to be the difference of the wild leek? And some people are going to be saying that's actually not the wild leek. It's going to be an elephant garlic. And so we know that, in the modern classification system, like wild leek or, elephant garlic, it's going to be a little bit different. So anyway, I just want to keep that in mind. I want you to keep that in mind that, some of these names are a little bit lost or, hard to piece together. And that's why it's very important to stick to the Meforshim. Have a great day.